different tone from Donald Trump. The US president speaks to Congress for the first time, taking a more conciliatory line. Does it signal a shift in policy, and will it last? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Well, Donald Trump is known for giving speeches full of tangents and side notes. The US president avoided that, though, when he gave his first speech to Congress. Trump stayed on script as he spoke about NATO, immigration reform and overhauling the so-called Obamacare. It's being described as Trump's most presidential and conciliatory public appearance yet. And critics say the change in tone won't trickle down to policy. Mike Hanna has the story from Washington, D.C.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
40 tempestuous days into his presidency, Donald Trump arrives to address the joint session. The applause, long and sustained, the differences of recent weeks apparently put aside in a display of bipartisan respect for the office. And the speech difference from the dark, bleak tone of the president's inauguration address?
I am here tonight to deliver a message of unity and strength, and it is a message deeply delivered from my heart.
The House Minority Leader, like many of her colleagues, wearing white in protest, not convinced, and continued to sit stony-faced as President Trump struck some familiar themes.
By finally enforcing our immigration laws, we will raise wages, help the unemployed, save billions and billions of dollars, and make our communities safer for everyone. We cannot allow a beachhead of terrorism to form inside America. We cannot allow our nation to become a sanctuary for extremists.
As expected, a call to repeal the affordable health care legislation.
Tonight, I am also calling on this Congress to repeal and replace Obamacare.
The divide on this issue clearly apparent as only half the House rise to applaud while the other remains seated with hands still.
We must support the incredible men and women of law enforcement.
On some issues at least there's unanimity, and the speech ended with a plea for bipartisanship and unity.
We are one people with one destiny. We all bleed the same blood. We all salute the same great American flag. And we all are made by the same God.
It was a speech about the president's vision for a better future, with few specifics about how to get there, but was warmly received by his Republican base, the support of which is crucial if President Trump's ideas are to be set in law in the months to come. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Democrats watching Trump's speech seemed unimpressed. They rarely joined the standing ovations. Some even booed. Well, the former governor of Kentucky delivered the Democrats' official response to Trump's speech.
Mr. President, as a candidate, you promised to be a champion for families struggling to make ends meet. And I hope you live up to that promise. But one of your very first executive orders makes it harder for those families to even afford a mortgage. Then you started rolling back rules that provide oversight of the financial industry and safeguard us against another national economic meltdown. And you picked a cabinet of billionaires and Wall Street insiders who want to eviscerate the protections that most Americans count on and that help level the playing field. That's not being our champion, that's being Wall Street's champion.
Let's bring our guest into the show now. We have in Washington, D.C., Douglas Ollivant, a senior national security fellow at the New America Foundation. In West Palm Beach, Scottie Nell Hughes, chief political correspondent for the USA Radio Network and a Trump supporter. And in London, Barry Gardiner, a British member of Parliament. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Scottie, I guess President Trump has never been short on surprises, but his address to Congress surprised people, perhaps many people, in a different way, a much more conciliatory tone. Why? What happened?
Well, what happened was you saw the same vintage Trump in message. However, his delivery, which was going to be the key all along, was something unexpected as he stayed pretty close to teleprompter, but he still was very hard hitting. He appealed to both sides of the aisle, and at different issues, both you might like what he said and you might also dislike what he said. So across the board, it wasn't a heavy partisan speech. It was something appealing to all, leaving out a lot of the issues that divide our country and more focusing on those that actually unite us and what we all
Scottie,
agree on.
why? Why was his tone so different? Was this a Trump because it was a Trump following the script, following the advice of aides? I mean, what's the reason behind everything you've just described?
Well, because President Trump, prior to becoming in politics, he was a businessman and he knows his audience and who he's presenting to. However, realize this, nothing he said was different from what he has said in the past necessarily. There were no new legislations proposed, maybe a little bit more clarification on immigration. He did propose the $1 trillion additional in private and public funding for infrastructure, but no real new legislation was posed. He stayed with the same message. It was all about delivery. And we have to realize this was a room that he campaigned against. He was elected because he challenged the status quo of the do-nothing Congress. So going into it, he had to realize his audience, both inside the room as well as those that were viewing, and he had to come out and be very careful in the crafting of his message without compromising the message, which is exactly what he was able to accomplish last night.
All right, Barry, I'm sure you were watching this as many were around the world. Was this still the real Trump, or one, shall we say, processed by the machinery of Washington, D.C.?
Well, I do think there's a certain irony in listening to Scottie as an avowed Trump supporter, expressing surprise that Donald Trump was presidential in his address. That's what presidents should be like. They should be presidential. And whilst I think many people were caught by surprise to find the tone was a much more grown-up tone, I think she's also right to say that essentially the hard-hitting messages, what I would regard as the rather right-wing messages of his address were very distinctly there. And I don't think anybody should be fooled by the fact that the tone had changed.
All right, Douglas, it may broaden his appeal. He did come across as more presidential in the opinions of even, critics. It might broaden his appeal in the wider population. But will it disappoint that style? Do you think it might disappoint some of his core supporters who wanted what they saw as a non-politician, a real man, a real person to go into the White House and speak in real words and real ways?
I don't think so. I think this was win-win for the president. As Scottie pointed out, his message was essentially the same, but as Barry pointed out, tone matters. And he sounded much more presidential. This was not the Donald Trump of the stump speech. This was not the Donald Trump of his Twitter feed. This was not even the Donald Trump of the inaugural speech. This was Donald Trump sounding like someone who now understands he's in the Oval Office, and that seems to have sobered at least the tone and the way that he's going out to address the public.
All right, Barry, do you think it'll be too much to expect that this is a turning point in the Trump presidency style, or is this a short-lived detour before we get back to the sort of rhetoric we've heard before?
I doubt anybody is thinking that President Trump is going to stop running his own Twitter feed. I think he is a president who clearly understands that he is communicating with people in a different way than previous presidents have done. He's using social media in a way that even President Obama was somebody who certainly used social media 8 years ago, 9 years ago now in the election campaign. But nobody, I think, has done what Donald Trump has done and really carried that Twitter activity at a personal level into the Oval Office in this way. This is a really astonishingly direct way of communicating. Many people in the American public seem to like it, but I think it can lead to indiscretion, it can lead to gaffes, and it can make you wonder whether the president is actually in full control, because you're seeing him at down moments. You're seeing him expressing flashes of anger or exhilaration in a way that we're used to seeing politicians come across in a much more measured and controlled fashion. That can be a positive thing because it's transparent, but it can also have its downside, I think. And I think the president's advisors would be well aware of that and probably counseling him to tone it down.
All right, I could see Scottie there smiling. I'm sure you've got something to say about that before I move back to Douglas. So let me give you a comeback in on that one, Scottie.
Well, I'm sorry to find that it's a surprise that Donald Trump is not the Manchurian candidate that we have seen in the past. But I do agree that Twitter has opened up the opportunity. But you have to understand, once again, the message is not changing. Remember, just a week ago, we saw him in Melbourne, Florida, saying almost a lot of the same things we heard last night, but in a different way of presentation. In the end, it comes to substance. He is a businessman. You cannot have a successful business and apply the same strategy to every room you walk into. But the key is the product stays the same. And that's how President Trump was able to win on the campaign trail. And last night, in the room that he was appealing to, the room that he was talking to, he had the same message, just a different tone. I guarantee he could do another rally, a campaign rally, and he would be exactly the same. And the key is I love this term presidential. He is the president of the United States. Everything he does is presidential. The times
No, that's not right, Scottie. No, absolutely not.
No, but it is right. That's what makes it when you're president.
Everything that he does is what the president does,
all right,
but
give
it's
Barry
not
a chance.
presidential. Presidential means something very different. You know, there are things like courtesy, there are things like discretion, there are things like good manners, and you know, the president seems to think that he can speak sometimes in a room as if it's a ball game and it's locker room talk. That's not presidential, even if it's the president of the United States doing it. Let's be clear about that. Presidential has a different meaning to it, and you can't just use words in that way.
Okay, I'm sure we can go on this point, but let's get to the product, as Scottie put it here. I'm going to try and focus on at least some of the policies or the issues which were raised in that speech. And Douglas, the fact that President Trump came out with such a clear condemnation of hate, particularly anti-Jewish hate and attacks on Indian engineers in Kansas, is that a sign that the media or the public pressure is bearing some results on the Trump presidency and how he approaches or how he speaks more forthrightly about some of these incidents?
I don't think so. I think he is growing into the office. As Scottie points out, he's a businessman. He doesn't understand the rules of politics, or didn't when he first came in, but he's clearly a quick study. Presidents are presidents of the entire United States. If a small minority of Americans is under attack or under siege, it's the responsibility of the president, as the president of the entire United States, to say something about that. He did that. I think this is a good sign. I agree with Barry. Being presidential means something, but that statement was presidential in the grand scheme of things. And I think, moving on very quickly, I think he's starting to now understand that the president can only do certain things by himself. He has a lot of discretion when it comes to immigration policy, and he's figuring out what that means. But the other things that he mentioned in his speech, if he wants a $1 trillion infrastructure package, if he wants to repeal and replace Obamacare, if he wants to give paid family leave, he needs the Congress to do that. All he can do is cheer them on and encourage them when it comes to those issues. So he had to go to Congress, and his conciliatory tone, I think, is a recognition that he's kind of run out of steam on the things he can do all by himself, and now he has to play ball with the rest of the government.
Okay, I'm going to latch on to a sentence you said there, Douglas. When he finds that a small minority of Americans are under attack, he has to speak out about it. Let me read some facts, though. According to an FBI report, November 14th, 2016, there's been an increase of 67% in assaults, attacks, and other hate crimes on Muslim Americans since 2014. Why didn't we, Scottie, see him speak out against Islamophobia and walk back some of his statements, his declared desire to, quote, ban all Muslims from entering the United States?
Well, but I think to a certain extent we did see that when he did talk about the clarification and saying it was not, and he didn't even bring up the fact of a Muslim ban because that's not what it is. He clarified. He says, I want to keep all Americans safe, all Americans of any faith.
But sorry,
safe.
Scottie,
And I think
it's not the same when you don't talk about something as when you come out forthrightly and say it's unacceptable to have a 67% increase in attack on fellow Americans, right?
Absolutely,
Or to
and
walk
I
back
agree,
a
and I think he
ban.
agrees with that one.
Don't you think calling for a ban on a particular people, that is something you would want to walk away from as a president?
But that's not what he did. And that's what we have to realize here, because the travel ban was not directed necessarily at one faith, as it only represented 15% of all of those faiths in the world. He wants to protect Muslim families that are here in America as much as he wants to protect a Christian family or a Jewish family, those that are here that are wanting to be safe in America. He wants to protect them just as much, because unfortunately, hate does not have an eye point, an eye view, and a bullet cannot discern between a Christian, a Jew, or a Muslim at that time. So I think that's what he's talking about. It's all people of all faiths here in America he wants to protect. And that's why those countries were listed not by faith, but by country. And I think this goes to the fact, the reason why last night was so successful. It was President Trump going directly with his words to the people, not being discerned by the media, not being filtered out by pundits, not being filtered out even by those in his own administration that I think tend to cloudy actually what his meaning is and why he does have the direct intention of protecting all Americans and all Americans, regardless of their faith, who are here that want to advance America and
But
put
Scottie,
America first.
why then, when he was campaigning, why did he talk about a Muslim ban? You say unfiltered by the media. That was unfiltered by the media. Those were his words. He talked about that Muslim ban. And what we have to understand, particularly if you're in politics or you're running for President of the United States, is that what you say then has an impact upon others. And the rise in hate crime, that has its source in the sorts of emotive language and the loose language that presidential candidates use. So you talk about this being, let's listen to what he says. That is what he said. Now, I welcome the fact that in the speech that he gave to Congress, he made a clear distinction, and he did. I think we have to give credit for that, between IS and those who were terrorist organizations in what he described as extremist Muslim organizations. And he also, I think the phrase he used was talking about how they had murdered and terrorized Muslims as well as Christians. And that's also an important point that he made. And I think he used the phrase good Muslims to refer to Muslims in America. But nonetheless, one has to take this as a whole and understand that there are right-wing groups in America who will have seen the words that the campaigning Donald Trump used about a Muslim ban as being a license for their activity.
Just to
and
jump
that,
in
I think,
on
should
that,
be a
on
cause
that
of
point,
shame
Barry.
and regret.
The Southern Poverty Law Center said in a report February 15th, 2017, quote, "The increase in anti-Muslim hate was fueled by Trump's incendiary rhetoric, including his campaign pledge to bar Muslims from entering the United States." I mean, Scottie...
Yes, I wish that he had said in his address to Congress, I wish he had said something to revoke that. I wish he had said,
okay, that's exactly...
I expressed myself badly.
Let's take that point, Scottie. But before we go there, I mean, again, just to be clear, what we're talking about is why he didn't walk back a statement, not what his executive order on immigration is. And just to point out one fact, for example, the FBI database cited by Princeton University in a study shows the overwhelming majority of terror attacks committed on the US soil between 1980 to 2005 were committed by non-Muslims. In fact, what they call Muslim extremists were responsible for only 6%, while what they call, again, not our terminology, Jewish extremists were responsible for 7%. Wouldn't it be irresponsible, Scottie, for a president to put facts into the right perspective and say, you know, I'm walking back from any blanket condemnations of any group, religious or ethnic or otherwise?
Well, first of all, you've quoted 2005. That was 11 years ago. The world has changed. The United States has changed in those 11 years. And yes,
I can quote you more up to date. We can go on with this, Scottie. The new American study says, quote, every jihadist who conducted a lethal attack inside the United States since 9/11 was a citizen or legal resident. I mean, I don't want to get bogged down. There is a lot of facts.
And it was a child of a refugee, hence why we're having the issue right now of extreme vetting, that we need to make sure that we're letting people in and following up and making sure that these folks are not here to do harm to our country and to our fellow citizens.
This is a quote by Erin Miller, that manages the Global Terrorism Database for the National Consortium of the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism at the University of Maryland, says, quote, it's certainly the case that none of the major deadly attacks carried out in the US were carried out by people from these countries, referring to the executive order. Now, again, I don't want to get bogged down.
But we're still talking about children of refugees.
I don't want to get...
The Boston bomber, the Orlando shooting. We got San Bernardino.
America is not a nation of the children of immigrants and refugees, though.
But it goes apart as to what they're actually, this next generation is being told. But let me go back to one point. You want to talk about hate, and I condemn across the board. There should be nothing happening. It's not right whether you are Muslim, Jewish, Christian, that you are having hate. We can all agree on that. But you also have to see, if you're going to quote the rise in hate crimes against Muslims, you also have to quote, and this is the one that's more visible right now, the hate that is rising up against those that are conservative, that are supporting Trump, the churches that are being burned, the Republican parties that are being firebombed, the people that are being beat up because they're wearing Trump hats and being assaulted outside because they have Trump paraphernalia on. There is hate crimes on both sides, and you cannot blame that rhetoric on Trump for his own folks being targeted right now.
Okay, we've got a few minutes left. I'm going to try and squeeze in some other policy issues. Douglas, Trump has made perhaps the strongest proclamation of support for NATO. Is that a shift in policy or just a shift in tone?
I think a shift in tone. I like to think that what he did was really a shot across the bow at NATO. Get with the program. You need to pay your 2%. We've been saying that for years. President Obama complained about it, but really had no force behind it. I'm going to put some force behind it. We were never going to walk away from NATO. We all understand that's an important alliance, but we do want them to pay their share.
All right, Barry, we heard him say how committed the United States is to NATO. How is that going to sit with his desire to get along with Russia? I mean, since one of course, as we know, NATO's primary goals is to counter Russian influence. How do you think that will be perceived, particularly in Europe?
Well, first of all, let me say that I think America has a legitimate grievance in that many members of NATO have not paid their fair share, their 2%, as they've pledged. My own country, the United Kingdom, does and continues to do so. And I think that's right. If you're a member of an organization, you pay your dues and you take responsibility for what you do. I do think that America's focus of interest is, though, shifting away from the North Atlantic and certainly is moving over to the Pacific. And I think there is probably much less commitment to an interventionist NATO in the European sphere from President Trump than there has been from previous presidents. I think that may well be bound up with his connections with Putin, and I welcome the fact that there should be good relations between Russia and the United States and Russia and the rest of the world. And I think that there was an unnecessary and unfortunate ramping up of provocation. And if President Trump does something to diffuse that situation, that is welcome. But I do think he has to be clear that he is a member, the most important member of the NATO alliance, and NATO is vital as a bulwark against any breaking up of the politics of Europe. I think it's really important that NATO is seen as a bulwark against any attempt to destroy nation sovereignty.
All right, you know what? I have a list here of other issues that we didn't manage to get into, but I'm sure we'll be back. We've got plenty of time, I'm sure, in this presidency to get into the other issues. For now, let's thank our guests very much, Douglas Ollivant, Scottie Nell Hughes, and Barry Gardiner. And thank you too for watching. As always, you can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now, is goodbye.